Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel, and my name is Chair, and today we are going to be reviewing the White Album by the Beatles. Now, as always, I rank the album in three distinct categories: the context of the creation behind the album, the track listing and the songs themselves, and finally the album cover. But we're going to dive right into the context, as where we left off was the Beatles were pretty aimless at this point with the death of their manager Brian Epstein and the increase of psychedelic drugs. We resulted in the mess that is Magical Mystery Tour. I think it's a beautiful mess. It scored very highly in the last episode. Check that out if you haven't already. But following that, the Beatles kind of needed some direction. Like I said, drugs and no direction, it wasn't very fruitful for them. So they were chasing direction. Now, what better way to help with that than taking a transcendental meditation trip to India with their new friend, Maharishi Yogi. Became a close friend of George Harrison's, as George Harrison would get more into the Indian culture and style of music that only grew in his life more and more. But the rest of the Beatles decided to all go to India for some time to detach from society and kind of rework the band for some new songs. Now, as I said, they're searching for direction, and the Beatles did find that in India. However, they also realized that they kind of found their own directions within themselves, and less as a band and more independent growth, as they started to become their own selves rather than just always a part of the Beatles. John and Paul started writing their own song, kind of in their own time, but also still worked together during this period. And then, like I said, George got deeper into the ability of playing sitar and Indian music while he was there. Now, some people stayed a little bit longer than others. Ringo would only stay like 2 weeks, while John and George would stay for a couple months. Now, you would think that this peaceful trip to India would lead to some calm, happy moments coming back to England, but that was definitely not the case. If anything, the moment they came back into the studio, everything became tense again, because now they're kind of all starting to push and pull for leadership in the band and where they want the band to go with this next album. At the same time too, the band started Apple Corps, their own management company, because they didn't want to really be managed by anyone else. So they instead took it upon themselves to create their own company, Apple Corps. That would become another business venture that would stress out the band more and more, and just adding fuel to the fire, really. For the band's eventual breakup. The recording sessions for this album was also a key part on the band having some difficulties with each other. Instead of all showing up and recording the same times and the same days, they would show up pretty much at very irregular hours. Some people would stay late at night, some would be early in the morning, and they wouldn't all always be together. So there was a lot of miscommunication of what certain people wanted on certain songs and what was lacking and if they weren't doing good enough. And it led to a lot of infighting and bickering, to the point where a lot of the staff helping with this album were very unhappy. Jeff Emmerich, which was one of the producers, he ended up leaving the band for a while. Ringo even ended up leaving the band for a while because he was just unsatisfied of where he wanted to fit in with the band. They eventually convinced him back, but John Lennon would also add stress to the situation by bringing along Yoko Ono, his new girlfriend of a sorts, as he was currently going through a divorce with his wife Cynthia. There was kind of a no girls allowed rule for the Beatles, that none of their partners or spouses could be in the studio while they were recording, but he ended up breaking that, and that added a lot of stress not only to the whole band, but especially the connection between Paul McCartney and John Lennon, as they were kind of a duo with the creation of the songs, but it added a little bit more tension there. You add that to the numerous amount of construction and retakes the band did on these songs. There were certain songs that had 90 to even 100 takes. There's a song that the Beatles recorded, it's called Not Guilty by George Harrison, and they recorded it 102 times, and they still didn't even put it on the album. So there was a lot of challenges during this studio session, and I think you can kind of tell when listening to it, because the one noticeable thing about the White Album, it is extremely bloated and extremely diverse. There's kind of like two sides to this album, where they are growing behind the scenes in the productions of the songs, but also as just songwriters and musicians in general. But on the other side, there's all this anger and stress going on, and it kind of mixes into this beautiful mold of this crazy amalgamation of what an album is, and the Beatles, of course, wanted to do their first ever double LP, so there is a sense of a lot going on, but at the same time, they're making some of their best music to this point, still with all this stress. So with all that being said, I think most easily, the context is a 5 out of 5. Once again for this album. Now onto the tracks. This is a very chaotic and spread out album. Like I said, it was their first double LP, and they decided to do as many genres as they could. There were folk, reggae, ska, rock, and even a little dash of metal sprinkled throughout 30 tracks on this album. But since there is 30 tracks and it's kind of hard to not talk about all of them, we're going to do a quick review front to back of the album. So kicking off the White Album is probably one of the best opening tracks I would say the Beatles have, which is Back in the USSR, a kind of spin on Beach Boys Chuck Berry kind of song, and I really personally enjoy this, but I think it's one of their best opening tracks in all of their discography for an album. A great rocker to start the show. Following that is John Lennon's song Dear Prudence, which he wrote to Prudence Farrow, one of the people that was on the trip to India, who had a deep isolation moment in the trip and wouldn't leave her room. So it's a very cute story that he wrote. Glass Onion is a diss track, I would say, John Lennon had to Beatles fans, and Obla-Di Obla-Da, though one of the more silly songs in the Beatles discography, was one of the tracks that almost broke up the band. That's how controversial it was to have on the album. It also was an early experimentation with ska music, which I think is pretty cool. Wild Honey Pie is certainly a sound that they wanted to put on the album, while Bungalow Bill is once again another John track from India. Then we get to probably George Harrison's best song in his career up to that point with While My Guitar Gently Weeps. People say it is still one of his best songs of all time. Easy to see why. It is an absolutely beautiful song, and of course has an amazing guitar solo by his good friend Eric Clapton, which I hope nothing goes bad between the two of those guys in the near future. Side 1 ends with Happiness is a Warm Gun, once again another extreme Beatles classic from John Lennon. It's another huge fan favorite, and though it took 95 takes to get the final product they were looking for, it is a beautifully dark, twisted song that many people enjoy. Starting off side 2, we have one of Paul's ditties with Martha My Dear, followed up by I'm So Tired, another Indian track by John Lennon, and then we get to Blackbird, one of the most covered songs of all time, and truly one of the most beautiful tracks ever written. It was about the civil rights movement and the Little Rock 9 incident at the time, and Paul was really reflecting on that. Piggies follows this up, a George Harrison track about greed and consumerism, while Rocky Raccoon is even said by George Martin, the producer, to be one of the most filler Beatles songs they put on the album. Following that is Don't Pass Me By, which is actually Ringo's first fully composed song by himself. It's okay. And then we have Why Don't We Do It in the Road, which is a really crazy number by Paul, and he completely flips the script following that with I Will. Two very different sides of a love song from Paul there. And then side 2, or I guess the first disc, ends with Julia, a very tender song by John Lennon to his mother, who he lost when he was 17 in a car accident, so a very more sad and somber way to end the first half of the White Album. Side 3 is where we really start to see that maybe the Beatles bit a little bit too much, more than they could chew, because now we're reaching the part where they have to fill a double album, and you can kind of start to see the inconsistency or maybe filler songs. It starts off with a couple jam tracks like Birthday and Your Blues. Your Blues is actually inspired by early Fleetwood Mac. Mother Nature's Song is kind of a soft, somber Paul-only track, while Everyone's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey, yes, that is the full title of the track, is once again another jam by John Lennon. He then follows it up with Sexy Sadie, which is a song about the Maharishi. Interesting, but yeah, you kind of start to get a very bland, jammy feel in the second half. Helter Skelter is next, and it's known as the creation or a starting period for the sound of the metal music genre. Now, back in the day, this was an obscene sound that no one has ever heard before, and though it's not as crazy to us now, what we know as metal was originally kind of inspired by this early sound that the Beatles were jamming with here on this track. So still pretty cool to think about it that way. And then side 3 ends with Long, 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 which is a George Harrison song which describes how we feel getting through this album. Side 4 starts with some political lyricism with Revolution 1, some smart words by McCartney and Lennon. Honey Pie is next, which is another ditty by Paul, and then Savvy Truffle follows, which is a George Harrison track about chocolate. As you can tell, we're starting to kind of run out of ideas. Cry Baby Cry pretty much floats under the radar. I don't even really remember much about that track. And then of course we reach Revolution 9. Now when I say that they were running out of ideas and throwing anything at the wall, this is a prime example. This is John Lennon and Yoko Ono's most experimental avant-garde track. It is 8.5 minutes of random noises, looping sounds, and don't get me wrong, it certainly has an idea and a plan of being this more experimental soundscape, trying to test their abilities in the production studio, but it does not mean that it is very good, at least to me, and it is certainly a sound to take up a good chunk of the final side of the album. And the album ends with Good Night, a beautiful, cute little Ringo song to close the 30-song buffet known as the White Album. So what tracks did I like? Out of the 30 songs, I would say there is a good amount. I think opening with USSR is absolutely amazing. Glass Onion is really fun and rocky. And though divisive, I do enjoy Obla Di Obla Da. Bungalow Bill is really fun hidden gem that I think is kind of underappreciated. Of course, While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Happiness are both classics that I have to listen to. Martha My Dear is a cute little ditty that I do enjoy some of Paul's songs that he does like that. And then of course Blackbird, you can't forget. Once again, another classic. Why Don't We Do It in the Road and I Will being right next to each other, I think grows the ability of both tracks, and I like them both as this amazing contrast of Paul's ability. Your Blues is a really fun jam track, and same with Helter Skelter. And then when you get to side 4, the only song I really like at that point is Revolution 1. That was one of the first Beatles tracks I've ever listened to. That was, I listened to it in middle school, so that is the first Beatles song I ever heard, and I still really do find a fondness with it to this day. Everything else does kind of feel like the bloated filler to me. And it does start to drag towards the end where you feel the length of the album, especially Revolution 9. So overall, I liked 13 songs from this album, which in general is a lot of music. However, when you compare it to the 30 total songs on the album, it does make the ratio kind of weird, leaving this category with a final score of 2.16 out of 5, still under half, even though I enjoyed 13 tracks. And there are some genuine best Beatles songs on this album. I think this is where the double LP starts to hurt itself because there is so much going on. It is hard to kind of bring it down to some of the best tracks on there because they are kind of spread out throughout the album, but it is still a great listen. And of course, finally, we reach the final category, which is the album cover. I don't really need to pull it up closer to you. It is genuinely a white square. It does have their name kind of in bold into it. But other than that, it is just a white square, and they were kind of going for a extreme contrast from the last 2 album covers we looked at, being these bright, colorful, psychedelic looks to now more of a stripped back feel. And though they were going for that, I think it's more of an excuse because the Beatles didn't really know what this album was going to be. There's so many genres and sounds and different directions they're going in. There wouldn't be a picture to kind of place to show what you're listening to. So this kind of is the best they can get. And it isn't as iconic as some of the other album covers we have. And it really is just a white square. To me, I think it was just one less problem the Beatles did not want to deal with all the other stress and problems they had kind of going on at this time. So unfortunately, I am going to give this a 3 out of 5. I don't think it's insanely awesome or cool. I think there is a couple ways you could perceive it as being, you know, a different side of the Beatles. But to me, I think it was one less thing the Beatles really wanted to do during this insane moment in their lives and as a band as a whole. So adding up all the scores, that gives our final score to be a 10.16 out of 15, which is still a great score. It is the lowest rated Beatles album we've reviewed in this series, but it still does make the top 5 of this series overall. at this current time, so still not a bad score, just kind of on the lower end of all the other Beatles albums we've looked at. But what do you think? Do you think the White Album is the best Beatles album? I would love to hear it in the comments and see kind of the different points of view or arguments had for that. And then of course what's going to even be more exciting is to see where the next album lands. Of course, that would be their follow-up, Abbey Road, one of the most iconic, well-known albums by the Beatles, as if all the other previous ones haven't been. But I will say this is going to be really fun to look at to see where this lands compared to the other Beatles albums. So please tune into that. If you haven't watched any of the other episodes in the series, please look at those episodes, because even though they have low scores, at the end of the day, they're in my collection. I find enjoyment in all the albums I own. As always, please like, comment, subscribe, tune into all the content on this channel. Much love to all the creators, of course, Jackie, Kylie, Anna, Claire. I'm excited to see all the new stuff they have working on as well. But as always, we will catch you around next time, and we'll see you then.